Welcome, Gothamites, to another episode of the Arkham Sessions. My name is Brian Ward. With me, as always, is the psychologist to the superheroes, superheroines, and supervillains of Gotham City and beyond, Dr. Drea Letamendi. Hello, Drea.
Hi, Brian. I hope we can talk about the She-Hulk episode we just saw.
That was exciting, right? She-Hulk.
So good.
The show was significantly better than I expected after that first trailer. Not just because of the CGI, but I just didn't know what I was going to think of the show itself. And once you lean into the fact that it's a sitcom, that it's basically a Marvel sitcom, I'm here for it.
Which is not too unlike the She-Hulk comic.
Correct.
I'm not, certainly She-Hulk is not a comic book that I've been reading a lot of, but I am familiar with kind of like the fourth wall, self-aware, humor, and certainly that orientation around She-Hulk's identity that is centered around her strength and her body. And that's a deep dive I would love to go into maybe on the show. I don't know. We could figure out a way to squeeze in a She-Hulk oversized episode, maybe in between some of our Star Wars episodes.
Or after the Star Wars episodes.
Sure.
Yeah,
that sounds great.
It's coming up. Let us know what you think of She-Hulk, either in our comments on Patreon or Facebook or Twitter, or just let us know what you think, and maybe we can talk about it.
Hey, there's a way that folks can actually let us know what they're thinking.
Oh,
we do now have.
Yeah.
Our own voicemail page. It's super easy. You just go to the website, click record, and share your thoughts. You can share questions. You can share recommendations. Maybe you have some deep thoughts about She-Hulk. And if you don't want your voice aired on our show, you can just let us know at the top or at the end of your message. We won't be airing all of our voicemails. That would be a tough task.
Yeah. Where can folks leave those voicemails?
You can find us. So go to speakpipe.com/the Arkham Sessions. Again, speakpipe. That's speak, SPEAK, PIPE, speakpipe.com/the Arkham Sessions.
Yeah, that'd be cool. Drea, it's been a minute since our last episode. I got to be honest. ComicCon really knocked me out. It was a work week that I have not experienced in 3 years, and so I was really quite tired after Comic-Con. Also, as you know, I've got a super secret sort of side hustle going on right now. That's kind of
super secret side hustle.
Super secret side hustle, which is something I could probably talk about a little bit later, but. Yeah, so I'm kind of doing like what feels like 2 full-time jobs, and so I have not been equipped to do a new episode, even though this episode is just going to be our panel, which we already recorded. But I wanted to ask you what your thoughts on Comic-Con 2022 are. The fact that this is a convention that came back after 2 years in a pandemic, 3 years since our last ComicCon experience, we were there in person. What did you think of San Diego in 2022?
I had a few mixed reactions. Overall, it was a very pleasant show. I made sure to pace myself, not overdo it, try to stay hydrated, eat healthy, wear my mask, just be very cognizant of the higher risk of COVID, because of course, a convention like this is a rarer circumstance when it comes to just the sheer density of people that you're around. But overall, it was a very pleasant experience. And I don't know, I felt like, I've been going to Comic-Con. How many years have you gone? I've been going since about 2008, maybe 2009.
I think I'm probably in 2002 or 3.
Yeah, so almost 20 years.
Yeah.
What I enjoy about Comic-Con, especially now, would be the experiences, the random meetups with folks I haven't seen in a while, the different formal industry experiences that they set up for us, right? The D&D tavern, the various setups at the different hotels, the opportunity to experience some of our favorite stories in really dynamic ways, interactive ways,
like
shareable
the
ways.
Activations
The activations. This is a collective social experience. It's really tough to go to Comic-Con and feel isolated or feel alone or feel like you are on your own in this celebration of the stories that we love. There is something very connecting, very shared, and while it's not perfect, there are few haters. Like, it's not like people are fandom shaming or creating a hierarchy of which fandoms are better or pitting one thing against the other, unless it's on a panel and it's kind of intended, right? There's a lot of love for everything. There's a lot of inclusivity. There's a lot of honoring everybody being there to celebrate the things we love. And there's a lot of consumerism, right? A lot of that is present, but overall it did feel really good to be in that kind of atmosphere and to be around people that shared the kinds of things, the perspectives, the anticipation, the excitement, all those feelings. It's really good to be in a place like that and know that even though we're kind of different in different ways, we might like different things, we're all there to celebrate and enjoy. And that felt really nice.
Yeah. I really enjoyed Comic-Con this year more than I expected to. And I was thoroughly impressed, especially after WonderCon and after Celebration, where they kept saying that there was a mask mandate, but there was very little they could do to enforce it. I would say easily 50-1 masks were worn on the floor of Comic-Con. And in the panel rooms. I mean, I can really only count 5 or 6 people that I even saw on the floor not wearing their mask. And I'll tell you right now, they were all in booths. Like, they were all like exhibitors,
like separated. Not that that's
not even separated from the crowd, but I noticed that any of the attendees and any of the people that were walking the floor, they were all masked. And it was like occasionally I would walk past a booth where the person talking to someone or taking their money was not masked. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Everyone else completely masked. Now, that was while you were on the premises for Comic-Con. Outside Comic-Con, all bets were off. You and I went to a after party, and we might have been the only 2 people there.
We weren't there very long.
Masked, yeah. Like, we both got a little nervous, decided to.
Well, I mean, look, let me talk about the panels for a little bit, and this is a good transition to our show today. I'd say that the highlight for me this year was the joy of panels. Attending a handful of panels, speaking on some panels, interacting before and after the panels. And a part of that is really just honoring, celebrating, and talking about the craft. What are the things that we do? How do we create stories? How do we support one another? What does it mean to collaborate? What does it mean to overcome challenges and barriers? And our panel was specifically highlighting the writers who are creating original stories and managing their own stressors, anxieties, and obstacles as they're trying to tell a story that's really important to them. So we included some authors and storytellers who knew that they wanted to tell dynamic, complex stories about characters who had some kind of mental health component or hardship or facet of their story. And one of the reasons I like doing panels is because you have the opportunity to have those questions and interactions happen in real time. And that's important. It's important for me to talk about mental health and to have the ability to debunk myths or clarify things or even tell people where they can go to get more support. And we get to do that in real time. So that was a highlight for me, just having those moments together, having a panel that centered mental health. And then, of course, making all that information accessible to people who were there just to learn more.
Yeah. Looking forward to playing that panel. It was creating stories with mental health in mind. And that is coming up. Before we do that, though, real quick, you just gave me the most amazing birthday gift just last night. You gave me an original animation cell from Batman the Animated Series. That was the Batmobile, a beautiful shot of the Batmobile. And then you had the most amazing cake made of the Tim Burton 1989 Batmobile.
It was a themed celebration. Batmobiles. Everything Batmobiles.
If you folks have not looked at our social medias, Drea's especially, she's got some amazing photos up there. Please tell everyone who made the cake, because I feel like there's someone who deserves a shout out.
Oh, absolutely. I was so thrilled to partner with Bree's Cakes, located in the Valley of Los Angeles. Bree is an amazing artist and has been featured in a lot of different television and streaming places. But she is somebody who I reached out to once I realized, like, okay, what I want to do is
elaborate.
I wanted to create a cake that was based off of the Iron Studios 1989 Batman Batmobile.
Yeah, the 1/10 scale, which is on a platform in the Batcave, and you even had her recreate the platform in the Batcave.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a gorgeous cake, and I want to thank you for that. It was delicious, and thank you, Bree. I definitely think folks should go check out our social media to see that cake. Let's get to it. Let's show off our panel from ComicCon 2022, and I think we can thank a few folks who are Patreon members for making this episode and others possible. That's Michael Pruitt, Weffy, Eric O'Sullivan, Rachel Acevedo Hoffman, Zach Neal, Mike Blanchard, Dr. Girlfriend, John Henry, my father, Carl Ward, Nick Gilbert, Dr. Jerome Anderson, Antonio Lopez, Todd Stashwick, Hero's Journey Fitness, David Nett and Christy Blacknett, Scott the Therapist, Frank Moeller, my best friend, Mark Pepper, Swara Salih, and our brand new patron, Emily Higgins, who is a dear friend and colleague of mine whom we got to meet in person for the first time at Comic-Con. She has a podcast of her own that is brilliant called Tasteless, where she pits two movies that you wouldn't even necessarily think were connected against one another as she finds the most amazing common threads and themes with those films. It's a fantastic podcast. You should go check it out, called Tasteless. Again, that's Emily Higgins. Thank you so much.
Shout out to Emily.
Yeah, she was one of our favorite people that we met at Comic-Con, and we're looking forward. She keeps trying to drag us to Dragon Con, so we'll see if we can make that happen. Until then, I'm Brian Ward.
I'm Dr. Drea Letamendi.
And here is our panel from Comic-Con 2022.
Comic-Con 2022, we've done it! That's cool. After 3 years, we are finally back here in person. How's everybody feeling? Is everybody having like the time of their lives right now? I do understand it is Sunday. It is the end of a long convention that we've all been training for, I know.
I have an idea. Let's all take a 5-minute group nap. Yeah. You all down for that? I'm just kidding.
She's the pro, so she would know what
we need it. We need the rest.
Everyone, my name is Brian Ward. I am a co-host of a podcast called The Arkham Sessions. We are a podcast that analyzes, we started analyzing every episode of Batman the Animated Series from the lens of a clinical psychologist. And since then, we have moved on to first season of Doom Patrol. We did the first season of Steven Universe. We've done the MCU up to Endgame, and now we're in Star Wars. So if you ever wanted to know about your greatest pop culture heroes or anti-heroes or villains, the Arkham Sessions is where you can find it, because we have a licensed clinical psychologist on that panel, on that podcast. Joining me is that clinical psychologist. She's a psychologist at UCLA. She's also a consultant for writers of film, television, podcasts, books, comics, you name it. She's Dr. Drea Letamendi. Woo! Right next to her is one of our dear friends. They are all our dear friends, so I'm going to say that a lot. But
it's like, wow.
This guy, you would know him if you've read any of IDW's Transformers comics in the last few years. He's one of their amazing artists. But in the last year or so, he's released his own creator-owned book called The Kill Lock, also from IDW, which is absolutely amazing. A very character-driven book, also with robots, so we're excited to talk to him about that. That's Livio Ramondelli. Hey. Next to Livio, I've known her for quite some time as I was producing Power Rangers DVDs, thinking, why aren't you writing more cool stuff? And now she's finally getting that opportunity. She is the writer of the upcoming series The Dead Lucky, which is part of the Radiant Black universe. She was also just this weekend announced as the co-writer for Radiant Pink, and she is going to be taking on Power Rangers. So we are very excited. She's Melissa Flores. And of all these people, I've probably known this gentleman the longest, maybe 20 years, and now he is also writing some amazing things. For starters, he is currently doing DC's The Flash. But a few years ago, if you were ever, are there any fans of like Supernatural in here?
Woo! Here we are.
Specifically, are there any fans who loved the Scooby-Doo episode? He not only wrote it, he pitched it to a mutual friend for a little while and finally got it approved. You've also been announced this weekend for a couple of things coming up in the Marvel Universe as well. We're going to talk about that. His name is Jeremy Adams. I just want to go down real quick. The premise of this panel basically is to talk about mental health in writing because it is so important. More and more people are realizing the importance of mental health these days. And so we're trying to make sure that it's represented accurately in film, television, comics, books, whatever medium we possibly can, because it's just not fair to say, that person's crazy. And that explains why the Joker has a gun. It doesn't explain it. So we want to talk a little bit about that and what it takes to actually write psychologically relevant and deep characters, something that all of these folks have gotten a chance to do. Real quick, I want to start with Livio and work our way down. Introduce the concept of the Kill Lock, what it was that made you decide you wanted to go off on your own and write it, and how you wanted to approach the characters in this book.
Yeah, so the Kill Lock, it's sort of like an R-rated Pixar movie, I say. It's about these 4 robots from very different walks of life who are linked together, where if one of them dies, they all die. So you have like a moral but sort of violent soldier protecting like an addict, and then you have like an engineer, but he's also like a psychotic engineer. So I wanted to mix like 4 very different characters that were all complex and sort of flawed, but over the course of the story you would find empathy toward all of them, you know. And I made it robots because I thought that made it a lot more entertaining. I mean, I think that story and that concept with humans is like more uncomfortable territory immediately. But I think robots and science fiction allows you to explore real world topics just a little bit removed, you know. You can look at them a little more objectively. And so, yeah, I was a fan of the Arkham Sessions, the podcast that Brian and Drea host. And I had a meeting with Drea early on about the Killock where I had these rough kind of character concepts, and I wanted to make sure that psychologically they came from kind of a credible place. I didn't want to do just like, this guy is crazy, like Brian said. I wanted to be like, okay, well, what were the steps that led to that sort of behavior? But yeah, that was the beginning.
Melissa, your upcoming book, it's August 3rd, right?
Yeah.
It's The Dead Lucky, takes a very unique and a pretty great approach toward returning veterans.
Yes.
Also, you're representing people of color in a way that often isn't seen. Talk a little bit about Dead Lucky, where that came from.
Yeah, so The Dead Lucky is a superhero series set in the Massiverse for Image Comics, and it was basically my take on what happens when a soldier who has had a very traumatic experience is forced to return home after losing most of their platoon and discovers that the home that they thought they knew, which is San Francisco, has been privatized by a company named Morrow and is no longer a safe home for them. So in addition to trying to understand what it means to be coming home, she's also dealing with a lot of PTSD and survivor's guilt. Very heavily inspired, not by myself, I'm not a soldier, but my partner Sandra, who is a U.S. Army veteran, and also we've known other veterans as well, and just the fascination I had with, one, being somebody who loves a soldier and seeing how they react to things that are maybe not the way I would react, that sometimes feels very civilian versus soldier. And also, what I thought was fascinating was what is being asked of them in terms of, you have all this incredible training, you are put in very high stress, traumatic situations that bond you with people that you see inevitably a lot of times die, both in the service and out of the service, and then you're asked to come home and just pretend like none of that ever happened and just reintegrate into society. And I really wanted to take a look at that and kind of honor that experience for a soldier and not tell it in a way that's something like a Lieutenant Dan situation of Forrest Gump, but really make them the focus points and take on that journey of what it means, not just for them, but the people they love them. That love them, and that was the inspiration behind The Dead Lucky, and she happens to have superpowers in a mech.
Yeah. And pretty cool superpowers in mech, I should say. Jeremy, you're currently killing it over at DC's The Flash comic. And something that you mentioned just the other night, something I wanted to ask you about specifically, is fans coming up to you and thanking you for ways that you have treated some of the characters because of other ways, not in a bad way, that other writers had done things or dug them into holes that maybe were ones they shouldn't be able to get out of. Right. But it's The Flash, so you run fast enough, you can go up those hills. Talk a little bit about coming into such an iconic character to begin with, and what you've done with them.
I think specifically with Flash, because it was my first time really writing comics, he had been, under the last editorial regime, a character that was kind of, at every turn seemed to be getting abused in a way. And although he's a fictional character, as a fanboy myself, I know that when somebody does something to a character I really love, it drives me crazy. And so in order for me to kind of authentically write that character, I wanted to redeem him in my eyes. And the only way I knew how was that, I come from a long line of people that are addicts, and, I spent some time in Al-Anon, which are adult children of alcoholics. And so there was this moment at the beginning, I knew I was going to be able to have a conversation between Wally and Roy Harper, who is a recovering superhero in the comics, and I knew that that was going to be the lens that I'm going to be able to talk about getting hope back. And I'm a big proponent, and it's never over until it's over, and there's a saying like, you don't leave till the miracle happens. And so that was kind of the journey of writing Wally in a way that I knew people go, oh, you redeemed him, and it wasn't really redeeming him, it's just he has that empathy and just giving him a chance to shine again. And I think everybody has that possibility no matter how low you are. So that's kind of how I approached it.
Can I ask, again, when you're dealing with an iconic character, someone who's been around for quite some time, how easy was that story to get through editorial?
Well, luckily, DC was being bought out every couple of months, so like nobody was minding the store. So there's a certain element of like you just write really fast and you just kind of go, oh, here you go, and then ignore anything that comes after that, and then oh look, it's out. You know, so and it's hard because you're also playing off of somebody else's story, and you want to be respectful to those stories because they're stories and important stories. But for me, that was the entry point. And everybody seemed to be, I don't know, I literally don't think anybody was paying attention. And it was like nobody cared that I was writing The Flash at where I was at, I felt like, or at least my editor didn't. And then suddenly it started gaining popularity, and now they seem to care a little more than I want them to.
You're a victim of your own success.
Yeah, exactly.
Dre, I want to ask you about consultation. You're not a writer, but you certainly get to inform some of the things that the writers hopefully are putting into the media out there. So I want to ask you about the importance of consulting for writers. Why should writers be looking for mental health consultation? Because we know that they look for other expertise. If you're a mechanic, they're going to ask you about mechanic stuff. But a lot of times writers just kind of ignore the psychological aspect. Talk a little bit about what you've done in the past with writers and why it's important.
I've been in the field of psychology for 20 years. It's a long time. But I've been an active professional in this field. And in the first half of my career, I very much enjoyed earning my PhD, being a part of the psychology industry, and found that something that we don't do well as scientists is give the science away, really disseminate the information so that others in our community can have it in very accessible and not just teachable, but also like usable ways. And so about 10 years ago, I started to work as a consultant, and it's been my favorite thing to champion not just the creative arts, but the individuals who are developing narrative and story, because that's where a lot of us can heal, right? What got us through the pandemic? Entertainment media, all of those stories, the things we were streaming, all the stuff we were watching on Cast or Netflix or Disney Plus, and then coming together on Zoom or on the phone or in text and sharing with each other our experiences. So being able to bridge the science of psychology and the creative arts has been such a huge part of why I love this work. And as a science consultant, I've had a handful of positive experiences. So what I do is I either work individually or with groups who are either at the very front end, maybe developing a character or a story. Working with Livio was such a treat because I think at that point you had already developed each of the four main characters who would be in your story, but you were still working on their interrelationships and some of the traumas that they were going to go through. And it was such a delight to kind of workshop that with you. And then I do have to talk about Warner Brothers in DC. About 10 years ago, Warner Brothers and DC Entertainment called me in to do some kind of like value-added material, on-camera commentary for a bunch of their shows and their animated films, and they continue to do that. In fact, Jeremy and I are on this. We ran into each other. Am I allowed to say? Can I say?
I don't know if we could say
No,
what
we
it
can
is.
say.
It was on a thing. It was coming.
It was a thing.
Up.
But it's so cool because
It's been announced.
it had. Yeah, I guess maybe I didn't say it. You can.
Don't
say
tell
it.
anyone.
I can talk about the movie. I don't know.
All
Just
right.
between those of us in the room.
So in October, there's a DC animated film featuring some superheroes that you're familiar with and their sons.
That's so weird because I have a movie coming out in October called Super Sons.
That's it.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's what a coincidence.
Yeah.
See, that's the loophole I just pulled out.
Right.
So honestly, I really champion DC Entertainment because they started doing this 10 years ago. They called me in as a science consultant, and they said, we really, we don't have to explain the stories to people. Your story, you wrote that script. The story speaks for itself, but I help kind of bridge that connection and amplify why we're connected to the story and hopefully validate the feelings that we have. And so, I think that especially because those emotional connections and sometimes healing and reparative outcomes happen through the storytelling aspect, that's what makes the consulting job super fun and really enjoyable for me.
And you get rewarded with things like being written into canon by Gail Simone as Batgirl's therapist.
That did happen, yeah. I did not know that was going to happen, but it did happen.
That helps. I want to ask the writers about any hurdles you've had with these characters and trying to flesh them out, make them three-dimensional. How do you avoid the trope of just making a villain, or making a hero a simple, pure, valiant. You're giving dimensions to these characters. What hurdles have you come across, and how did you get over them? For anyone who would like to, who's got anything in mind right away.
Well, for me, it was obvious. I mean, I am not a soldier, and I was very hyper aware of that. I didn't want to just have BB be a soldier just for like a sake of badassery. It feels like an easy check mark to be like, oh, well, this character knows all this because they were a soldier, and so now they have all this. And I feel like you see that a lot. I wanted this to be a different kind of story. Yes, she has these skills, but I wanted very much to have anybody that read this that was maybe a family of a veteran or a veteran themselves that could read them and see authenticity in the character. I didn't want to speak for all soldiers or their experiences, but I wanted to be true to their experience. And so thankfully, I'm obviously very close to a veteran, and I have friends that are veterans, and so I was able to really, Sandra consults on every issue, and I wanted to make sure that it wasn't a statement that felt political. It was just, this is the experience. So you actually see the opening issue of BB in therapy and having these discussions, and I wanted to pepper the character with little moments of authenticity that maybe I had noticed through observation or I had heard discussed, like she doesn't like sitting with her back to the door. She has a very real love of Army MREs because that is just a comfort food for her. And I felt that those little things would be hopefully enough that create authenticity in the character. It doesn't feel exploitive, but maybe feels like makes whoever's reading it feel a little bit of a kinship or a little less alone when they read that, because they recognize some of that behavior in themselves.
I really, when I read the comic, appreciated the inclusion of the therapist room. And I think that, and actually Gail Simone did this several years ago when she created the therapist for Batgirl. And Gail had asked me, what does the therapy room look like? I mean, these questions that I realize a lot of people may be anxious to ask or not know. They may not have seen it and they feel uncertain and maybe hesitant to picture this. So in a way, what you did to really to show that in this comic and to show the hero being in the patient seat is to normalize therapy and counseling and to kind of, demystify all of those different maybe tropes or misunderstandings about that, and create that landscape that is this certainly fundamental to this character as we begin to know her.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like with any story, a superhero story regardless, like you need to have growth and change in a character, and you have to start them somewhere and then end them somewhere else. And I feel like for BB especially, the whole theme of her story is she's dealing with a lot of grief, and she does not know how to handle it, and she's closed herself off and is kind of living between the world of the living and the world of the dead. In order to truly heal, she has to talk to other people other than herself. And so that's why in issue 1, she talks to herself, and she does not talk to other people, not even her therapist. And I wanted that to be really blatant and clear, because it's not just about BB, but about the people that love her and who she affects with her behavior and vice versa. And so it was really important for me to start her in therapy, because you want to see throughout that journey how therapy helps her as well open up to the people that love her.
And something that I thought you did really well is she doesn't just talk to herself, she's talking to the reader in some cases, and not just in a thought bubble, not just in narration. She is straight up looking at the audience and telling you some bit of information that we should know about her, and that's a really interesting way of doing it, and it pays off very well. Sorry about that.
Oh.
I did that. That was me. Just in case you were wondering, that came from over here. Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but when you mentioned that you had this character speaking to herself, I'm instantly thinking of the best ways that you could have portrayed that, and I think that nailed it.
Yeah, I mean, that was absolutely on purpose. I wanted to make the reader a little uncomfortable. I wanted them, usually in a comic book trope, you see, you know, the Batman kind of like, I am the night and everything is dark. And that's how you get into their head. With BB, she's not talking to anybody but herself. But if she's looking at you, you're kind of forced to look back. And if you read the issue 1, I know it's out August 3rd, I promise. I know you guys haven't read it yet, but you see her constantly making people uncomfortable with her talking to herself and them just dismissing it, and her dismissing it as well. You see a soldier who's like, oh, it's a Lieutenant Dan situation, and you see, you know, one of her best friends being like, the army made you weird, and she does that on purpose so that they don't have to look at her. But as a reader who's trying to get into BB and her story, if she's looking straight at you and talking to you, especially that first window where you're expecting a bubble or some kind of voiceover and it's her literally doing this, it kind of forces you to take a little bit of a breath and be like, okay, this is different. I'm not used to this. Am I even comfortable with this? And then hopefully, you know, by the end, you'll understand why that happens by the end of the first issue. And maybe hopefully it'll make you go back to the beginning and be like, okay, now I see what's going on.
Livio, there's the Killock obviously deals with machines that you even said, if these were human characters, it might make you very uncomfortable to read this awkward situation. But I want to ask you about the humanity that you have managed to infuse into these robot characters. Talk about why you decided to make them so human, so flawed, and how you have managed to, in our opinion, get it right over the 2 series.
Yeah, I think I met some resistance early when I was like pitching the series because people would say, oh, the characters are robots, how are we going to empathize with them? And I'm like, I think people like R2-D2 a lot. And having worked on Transformers for years, I know the death of Optimus Prime had a huge impact on people. So, and then every Pixar movie is mostly not people. So I'm like, I think you can totally make almost anything relatable and, you know, deep. And so I just approach them as, what if they are people? They just happen to look like robots. So they get angry, they make jokes, you know, they have addictions, and I think it's just sort of framed in a more sci-fi world. But I think that makes the story hopefully more entertaining. One of the characters is like an addict, you know, and I think that topic becomes uncomfortable. But I agree with you. Like, I am also a fan of, like, I like stories where you get a little uncomfortable and your characters don't have to be fully likable at all times. I think that makes them interesting, you know. I think the more layer you can give to something, certainly the better. So
I remember reading the first couple issues and texting you and being like, what? This is so brutal.
Yeah.
Did not imagine that a bunch of robots would be so human-like in their brutality. And that's kind of what kept me close to the story, that we can relate to some of those feelings. And I think certainly this is true for maybe any robot that we connect to, especially in stories that you mentioned. But the ability to tell a story that we can maybe be uncomfortable about, but stay in the story, that willingness to be in those tough emotions is huge for us. It helps us with our own ability to regulate emotions. It helps us with maybe dealing with some of the feelings we have. A lot of your characters feel angry, they feel resentful, they feel hopeless and helpless, and we've had times of the last couple of years that we felt this way. So that story really appealed to me and felt important to me for those aspects.
Livio, I want to ask, of the 4 characters, because each one is sort of not necessarily a good character.
The kid's okay.
The kid's okay.
There's an innocent kid robot.
The kid's okay. Maybe innocent, we don't know. Yeah. Which one is your favorite to write for?
Oh, there's the worst character in terms of personality is this character called the Artisan, who's this engineer. So he comes from the most elite levels of their society. So he's the most intelligent, the most sophisticated, but he's by far the rudest. The way he talks to everyone, it's just, he knows he can be polite to people. He just chooses not to be. And so I find that character very interesting. Like, I'm a huge fan of The Game, the David Fincher movie. If anyone's seen it, like Michael Douglas is this banker in that movie who's very, very smart, but just has absolutely no time for anyone else. And I like that kind of, like, he's so kind of cold and cruel, but he's aware of what he's doing, you know? And so that's probably the most fun. Like, you write a character with absolutely no filter.
And he's also a little Hannibal Lecter-ish.
Yeah.
To some degree.
There's a psychotic-ish, yeah.
So, Dre, a question for you. What does this say about Livio?
I was just going to say. Yeah.
Jeremy, I want to ask about The Flash, and we've talked a little bit about bringing your own voice to this iconic character. What did you want to bring into The Flash, and how did you find, like, what aspects of this character, because it's a long-running character, it's certainly been written by a lot of people who've added their own flavor. What flavors did you want to make sure these characters had? What did you bring to them yourself?
Fortunately, the Flash and I are in very similar stages of life. Both married with 2 kids, and he's very fast. I'm on Red Bull. It's like it's all a symbiotic relationship. So there's a certain lightheartedness that I try to put into the book. I was thinking about what you were saying, entertainment during this lockdown and during the pandemic, and I remember when Ted Lasso happened, and it just felt like a breath of fresh air, and it was just cathartic to watch. And to a degree, I think there's a lot of really great, really dark comic books out there, and I was just trying to do a counterpoint and just be like, I just want to be something that anybody can go to and have a good time. And there would be moments of addressing, and usually when I address something like, I had an issue with Heatwave, who found out, he has cancer. And there was a moment where Wally didn't beat him up. It was more like, I can get you help. Like, we can work through this together. It was a very human moment. And I got a lot of feedback from people who really enjoyed that, because Wally looks at the world with a lot more empathy than even me. So it's kind of interesting to write somebody and just be reminded of the humanity of everybody around you, and just having a little more love and grace for it, even if they have flame guns or whatever. So, I think, you guys were talking about all this stuff, and I was just thinking about the arch villain of it all, and how tropey that can be. And I know for me in writing, it's like, if Cobra Commander really existed, like, how could he exist?
Right.
And really thinking about that cycle. Like, what would be the steps a real person would start wanting to put his face on the moon? Like, what would that person be? And I know for me, it really does help me get into the skin of so many characters, and helps, I think, the audience connect with it, because you don't feel like it's a lie when you're reading it. And all that cycle. I mean, Dre, you probably read comics and understand that the authors of these comics have serious problems. Like, depending on who it is, you're like, oh man, yeah, I need to send them a note.
It's actually comics that got me into psychology.
That's amazing.
Isn't that crazy?
That's cool.
Yeah.
And a certain animated series.
Batman the Animated Series. Yes.
But I think it was even one of your predecessors, Jeremy, that said in the documentary, was it Necessary Evil, Supervillains of DC Comics, that I believe he was talking about, or someone was talking about, the fact that a villain, if you were to look at the definition of a protagonist, and the protagonist is the one that moves things forward, villains are actually the protagonists of the story. It's the heroes of the story that are trying to hold back everything from moving forward, and they become the antagonists to some degree.
That's awesome. Who said that?
It may have been Jeff Johns.
It sounds like Jeff.
Yeah.
I think Jeff, we're doing this book called Flashpoint Beyond, and I'm like, yeah, let's beat up bad guys. And he's just like, this has to mean something. Like, and it's like, and it's really layered, and I'm like, oh, that's a lot of layers. Like, but that does sound like him. He's very philosophical about those sorts of things, and I try to be, but people need to get kicked.
This is true. Dre, I want to ask you about mistakes. For any, do we have any, like,
none of these folks have
aspiring
made
writers?
any mistakes.
I want writers. Writers, raise your hand. You're not aspiring. If you write, you write. So, for anyone who's looking to try to infuse actual mental health, mental illness into their stories, give us some of those mistakes that people tend to make when doing it.
There can be some pitfalls that I've seen that
I will talk about. I first want to say that if you're writing anything, there is psychology in your story. It's inevitable. We all are complicated people, and even if we're not people and we're robots or any other beings, sentient beings, there's going to be struggles, there's going to be challenges, there's going to be an arc, right? So psychology is probably already in your story. I also want to say in real life, 1 in 4 of us will struggle with a mental health disorder at some point in our lives. Studies show that the pandemic has worsened that, so that number is going to be higher over the course of the next 5 to 10 years. And so I just want to say that to amplify that, like, it's not us versus them or any kind of like divide between mental health and mental illness. There's a lot of gray in between. And I love the stories that will celebrate and honor that gray in between, that wellness and illness aren't separate things, but there's some activity in between. And when I have seen mistakes, honestly, I see mistakes in television and film. And the first one that I often see is when a label or diagnosis is used. So in the past, I've seen certain diagnoses like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, multiple personality disorder, some of these labels that are used as a shortcut to say that someone is the bad guy, the villain, or that something's wrong with them. And then they get the rest of it wrong, right? They didn't research what the experience or presentation of that diagnosis is. And so my advice for a lot of writers is, do you really need that label? Do you really need that diagnosis? In some cases, I'd say, especially with depression, anxiety, and PTSD, the label is necessary because we're trying to really kind of get the landscape for something that happened that then triggers these responses. But other than that, do you really, once you have a diagnosis that you're using, you've now boxed yourself in and you need to do your due diligence and talk to a consultant or do some research, even Googling, right? And get the framework for what a person living with that disorder would experience. And then I'd say, I started to say this, but I think probably something that we are seeing a lot in, not even in entertainment media, but in news storytelling, the news media, is this connection between mental illness and violence. And the mistake is that if someone is engaging in violence, that they have a mental illness. And the reality is that if you have a mental illness, you're likely to be the victim of violence, not be the perpetrator of violence. So that's something that all of us are struggling with right now. How are we able to tell the real story about what's going on when we see mass shootings and extremist violence? And by the way, I use entertainment media like our podcast to explain those differences and to try to amplify some scientific truth as we're asking the very same questions that you probably are.
Well, I'm reminded of one early instance where we were talking about the Joker and the impossible diagnosis for the Joker. And there could be many diagnoses for the Joker, especially depending on who's writing them. But I remember at one point it was posited, well, he's right now showing signs of anti-personality disorder. And what was interesting was we then had a father write into our podcast and say, my son was just diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. Is he going to become the Joker? Mm-hmm. And that's the important part, is the illness is not what makes you the Joker. So even if you find out someone was diagnosed with this, it's all treatable, and you've wanted to make that very clear, and you can still be a wonderful person with antisocial personality disorder if you're treating it properly.
By the way, the Joker always works best when you can't nail down what's really going on with him, right? And some of my favorite stories that center on the Joker are his multiple perspectives, our inability to really even trust his own self-reports. That's a really, I guess, fun character to work with because you are always kind of guessing and never really boxing that character into some anticipated behavioral pattern or profile.
I want to ask, are there characters out there? Are there writers or instances that are getting it right? Anything that
yes.
you can...
Oh my gosh, Moon Knight. Did you all enjoy Moon Knight? I thought that was a fantastic series. Moon Knight is, how many episodes? 6 episodes, I think. Deserved the length of that to really tell the story about somebody and
what I liked about that is they really centered on this being a memory disorder. This isn't necessarily, although there's trauma involved in his past, although there is identity struggle, this is truly a neurobiological memory disorder. And I've seen no other film or series really center on his mental illness in this way and make him the hero of the story. If you've seen the movie Split, that's the exact opposite of this in some way. I found that was a way to show multiple personalities as, again, kind of a shortcut for the villain character. And in many ways there were a lot of mistakes there.
Usually the proper shortcut to villain character is redhead. That'll be
no.
That'll be what that are just straight up victim.
Also, if you're watching The Boys, are you all enjoying The Boys? I think The Boys is a great show. One of the things I do is write articles for Fandom, and I'll usually take a character and kind of write an in-depth analysis. And Homelander is a character that truly is a maniac, right? But that allowed me to talk about things that people are asking questions about right now: narcissistic personality disorder, some of this kind of love addiction stuff going on. So a lot of us love these characters, but of course, if this were a real character in real life, it would be really horrific, right? Terrible to be that close. But when you can do that with a fictional character, it really allows you to get into their psyche, be close to some of these things, and even, at least in my case, talk in depth about what might be going on with them and hopefully help other people recognize all of those aspects or some of those aspects in themselves or in people around them.
I want to give folks an opportunity. We've got a mic here in the center. If you have questions of your own, we would love to take them.
Okay. Hi, everybody. This is a great panel. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you.
Glad you brought up The Boys, because I hope that you get there with the Arkham sessions at some point. But my question here is, as we open the panel up, I say we like I did anything but sit here. Brian made a comment about how it's not just okay to say, oh, that person's crazy anymore, right? And Andrea, a little later, you talked about how every story has some kind of psychology in it, whether or not it's intended. So my question is, as we look at what we've talked about in this panel, there's been a lot of talk about people who are deliberately trying to make an impact in terms of accurately representing mental health. But I think there's a lot of writers out there who aren't trying to do something wrong. They're not trying to actively recognize mental health, but they don't even necessarily recognize what's going on in their stories. And I think about a premiere I saw the other night, which I'm not going to name because it did a lot of great things, and I don't want to seem like I'm up here bashing it, but at one point somebody asked why the villain did something, and really quickly they just went and said, oh, because he's insane. And the first thing that I heard Drea on the Arkham session saying, insane is not even a diagnosis that we use, right? And here we are, 20 years later, still, hearing this language used. And I'm just curious, it seems like there's a lot of great resources for people who want to make a positive impact here, but we still have a lot of very powerful people who don't necessarily even recognize the impact of the language that they choose in their writing. Yeah. And I'm wondering how the people on this panel see the potential for getting writers who may not even be aware of the need to be more deliberate with their language to recognize that. Thank you.
Thank you. And by the way, Drea, real quick, define, because there are people who like insane, like the insanity plea.
You're right. So insanity is a legal term that is not a mental health diagnosis. And so if you're using that term, I use that word. This is something that I appreciate the question, because language really helps us form some things outside of writing, right? Language is a part of our relationships and culture, and there are ways in which we use language sometimes to improve mental health awareness and reduce stigma, but a lot of times we're still using language that can do the opposite of that, right? So when I use words like crazy or insane or bizarre, or sometimes I'll say bonkers, on the show I'm like, that's bonkers all the time. I'm not talking about a person. So if we're being person-centered and we're talking about a person, it's none of those words, right? Because those words aren't even diagnostic terms scientifically. I use those words to describe a situation or maybe even a feeling that I carry. So so going back to the word insane, it's a legal term. It's not a diagnostic term and should really rarely be used unless you're referring to some kind of legal description.
Plus, it doesn't help when in those courtroom dramas where they say that they're insane because it really hurts their own prosecution. They're like, oh God, please don't let them be insane. Does anyone have any recommendations for how would you get an editor at a comic book, to allow real life sort of?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's like, I think that it just depends on the story. Yeah. And I also get like super prickly when people are like, writers shouldn't write these words. It's like, well, damn you,
Yeah, that's right.
And I know that's not the case, but I also think that if you're a good writer, you also realistically, if you're writing Grey's Anatomy, you need to know something about medicine or have some, medical vocabulary as they're opening up someone's chest, not just be like, hit him with the zing-zang, and it's like, that's not real. So you don't want to be like an idiot.
I had that done once. Yeah, insurance didn't cover it.
I think I was there. No, okay. Anyways, but I do think, and it just depends on the movie or the tale. I think about Halloween all the time, and I think about the fact that Dr. Loomis is like, he's just evil. And it's like, that's just the movie.
You're a bad doctor.
He's evil. Yeah. I mean, if somebody stopped and go, well, listen, Loomis, no one's just evil, and then Mike Myers stabs him or whatever. But I mean, it's just the context by which anything is done. Because if you're dealing with supernatural or you're dealing with whatever, but what I love about just the conversation at all, I remember the first time that I was exposed to you guys doing this, I thought, oh, this is going to be hilarious. They're going to talk about Batman, the animated series. And then it was like, I remember being at a con, and it was like, oh, you're like legitimately helping people. And it was the same experience I had going into an Al-Anon room. And if you have issues, realizing that everybody has issues, and then knowing that you can get help for those issues, it's just such a weight off your back. And I think sometimes when I'm writing stories, I'm thinking about that. It's like, it's not just about evil versus good. It's about redemption, or it's about this person can get help, or this person needs to be killed. No, just kidding. But I mean, like Hans Gruber, right? Yeah. But yeah, I think I try to be cognizant, and I think this day and age we try to be a little more cognizant about everything. Mm-hmm. But also, hopefully, the reader has grace for you if you screw it up every once in a while.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. I think for me, I always come from a very lonely. For me, I feel like as people, we tend to feel very lonely and alone, and it's very easy to forget that the person sitting next to me is also a person who has felt things as intensely, or has felt as badly about themselves, or as happily about themselves. It can be very easy to isolate yourself as a person and think that you are truly alone and nobody understands or has understood what you are going through. And so for me, you hear so much you wouldn't understand. And I feel like, especially in comics and media, there's a way to put it that destigmatizes these things that we don't want to talk about, and still make you feel a little less alone. If you can see parts of this behavior in somebody else, maybe it will give an opportunity to talk about it. And I think it allows us to have this conversation. I mean, even The Dead Lucky isn't even out yet, but just from the previews and podcasts that I've talked to, I've had people talk to me about, maybe they weren't a soldier, but they had an instance that brought about a lot of survivor's guilt. Or maybe they are friends of a veteran, and they're like, this makes me feel like I can relate to this story. It makes me feel like it helps. Not because I am healing the world by any means, but just sometimes even just knowing you're not alone in this, and you've also felt something, whether it's happy or sad or this situation, sometimes even that just helps a little bit. And I think if you come from that place, it's very easy to stay respectful of the issue you're trying to portray, because you're not coming, it's not being treated as a trope to get what you want, but rather a trait of a character that you love deeply and want people to help understand.
I remember there was a short Batman arc, I Am Suicide. Do folks remember this one or read this one? And I was surprised that DC would not only use this word, but have it be in his monologue and his self-talk. And that comic is going to reach more people than I can. And so all of you are reaching more people than I can in your efforts to talk authentically and in a straightforward, candid, transparent way about mental health.
And all of you writers now have it in your minds to try to treat it properly. So please do, and we'll be able to push it all forward. Thank you so much. Next question.
Hello. This has been very interesting. One of my favorite panels so far.
Thank you.
You have touched a little bit on like the dark versus the hope, responses to trauma, and essentially the approaches. And you have, your stories like for Superman, for example, you have your Injustice version, and you have the All-Star Superman version, which is, like more hopeful. So how do you deal with, the success that kind of the dark approaches have versus the less success, the less, mainstream of the hopeful versions? Is there anything that you do to kind of propose that a little bit better, like to support that more?
It's funny too, because Jeremy, you've written clearly, like you're doing The Flash right now. There's some trauma in there, but you're also regularly writing Lego movies for DC, and so you've been able to do the lighthearted and like. Yeah. Have you seen a difference in those two? I mean, obviously you've seen. I hope. Like
from writing standpoint, or just from. I mean, like, kids can watch those, I did a Mortal Kombat animated movie. It was extremely violent, and we're just like, from the people that brought you Lego Aquaman, and it's just different. It's just different. I mean, all stories almost the same, except some can be funnier, and you can push the envelope with certain things. With the hopeful stuff, I just keep thinking about those moments like I said, like Ted Lasso. And it's also those moments where you go, the pendulum swings with storytelling. What's in vogue and not in vogue. It's like, Seven comes out, and it's just like everything's dark, and then the next thing you know, Happy Gilmore's there, or whatever, It's just a different taste level, too, I love Tom King. I'm just not going to ever be Tom King, because I don't think I could even go to those dark places sometimes. And I appreciate people that can, because I get engaged in those stories. Yeah. But I just want to joke in that moment, so that's probably just me dealing with my own trauma.
Hello. One of the things that I find missing from the conversation about mental health a lot is learning differences, of ways that brains are different but not necessarily diseased or ill, or there's something that's different about them, but it's not wrong, it just doesn't fit into our society. And I'm a science educator, and I run into that all the time in my classroom, of students that most of the stories they're exposed to take learning differences as a shortcut for stupid. And I was wondering if you have any resources or any ideas or any thoughts about going beyond like the scary things like schizophrenia that are words that are designed to cause anxiety in the reader, just to represent those mental differences that are real and important and affect more than just someone's grades.
That's such a great question. We're hopefully at this precipice. I know we're turning the corner where most of us realize that many of us are neurodivergent in many ways, emotionally, neurocognitively, in our personalities. And that's just our individual differences. And we want to see ourselves in these stories. We don't want to be left out. So I really appreciate your question about how neurodivergent characters and storytelling can be included and not have to be framed in a deficit-based kind of story or dynamic. I think a lot of the folks on this panel are doing that because what it takes is to have the hero. Our main characters show all of their, different parts of themselves. On our podcast, we talk about, it's a little bit of a tangent, but we talk about this concept of like no bad parts, which is coming from the framework of family systems therapy, where all of us are not just like one thing, we all have like different unique abilities and attributes in our psychology, and they're not all good. Like all of us are going to have some aspects of ourselves that feel different or that don't work in the same way as other people. So I don't know that I have a good resource. I will say that when we covered Steven Universe on our podcast, we shifted from talking about mental illness to talking about neurodivergence in terms of personality style, in terms of different ways that people think. And I thought that was a great show. If you've not seen Steven Universe, it's an awesome show that isn't from a deficit-based framework.
Hi, so I just have a quick question. I'm a writer that studied psychology and values authenticity, and so having resources like a consultant to incorporate authenticity into my writing is really important to me. So how do you get a consultant?
Can you repeat that last part of the question?
Yeah. How do you get a consultant to help you with your...
Oh, I see. How can writers make relationships with consultants? There's not a lot of consultants that have kind of like a collective, or like, oh, psychology.com has a separate tab and it's like, get your consultation. Certainly,
there's the science exchange, the scientific exchange.
Right. So there's, do you know the website for that?
The Hollywood Scientific Exchange. I do not know it right off the top of my head, but it's basically where you can go and you can find what kind of consultant you need or what kind of expert you need, and they will hook you up with someone. And then there's also just going to drdreapsychology.com. She might be able to help.
We have covered almost 200 episodes that really run the spectrum across so many different psychological presentations and experiences. So you might literally find an episode that is going to explain or give you the information you need. I'd also say the Science Exchange is a great connection. If you can look in the program, Bringing Hollywood into Science, that's a panel that was done actually in this room a couple nights ago. That's going to have the names of people who do science consultation. So I'm a behavioral science consultant, but you can also find neuroscientists who are consultants. You can find physicists who are consultants through that Science Exchange as well.
I believe that it's called the Scientific and Entertainment Exchange.
That sounds right, the Scientific and Entertainment Exchange. Thank you so much.
One moment, I gotta write that down.
Everybody's taking notes.
Hello.
Hi.
Okay, thank you all for your beautiful minds, and also I want to tell you a bit about my kind of beautiful mind. I've lived with CPTSD for a long time because of years of abuse from two narcissistic personality disorder parents. And I plan to write that into my story, but it's going to be traumatic as fuck. So I'm curious, do I count as a consultant with my own lived experience? And also another follow-up question, how can I do that scene justice without horribly triggering whoever may be reading this and it resonates with them too?
Yeah, so the question is, how would you write from your own experience, but also make sure that everything was covered, also without triggering the people who might be reading it? That's basically, yeah. So you, Melissa, you have spoken a little bit about this, the fact that you are writing with characters in mind, but you don't want to trigger them as they're reading them.
Yeah, so I mean, that has actually happened to me, where I have written a scene that was then acted out in front of somebody who then had a very triggered reaction. I had no idea until they were sobbing on set, and I regretted it deeply. What I would say is consent is very important. Warnings, trigger warnings, also incredibly important. Making sure that you are in a place where you are putting yourself first in terms of your own mental space, so that when you write these scenes, what I always say is that, this is before I even wrote this, I made sure that my partner was comfortable with me talking about these topics with people. But I also check in literally every time, is this okay to share? Is this something that you're comfortable reading? Is this something, and it's just a constant conversation, and I feel like that's one that you'd also have to have with yourself. Am I in a place today where I can think about this and talk about this, or is it going to, really affect me for the next 3 days? Well, then maybe today's not the day to write that scene. Maybe I put that and try to focus on something else. And you have that conversation with whoever's helping you as well. Is this, today this is a scene that maybe I'm thinking about exploring, and just make sure that wherever you feel safe, no matter what you're doing. And if it does happen, because it probably will, just give yourself the license and the acceptance to say, hey, I'm not okay right now, and stop. Or have them stop and just have that open and just check in and make sure that you are taking care of yourself no matter what.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we have to wrap it up. I want to give our panelists an opportunity to let the folks know where they can find you online. We want to start with Jeremy and work our way down.
Space Kicker on Twitter. That's my name. There you go. You can find me online there. And
Awesome.
from there, everything else.
Misty_Flores on Instagram and Twitter, and you can see me in the Mighty Morphin Power Ranger comics with Boom, Radiant Pink with Image, and as well as Dead Lucky starting next month.
Livio Ramondelli on Instagram and Twitter.
DrDreaPsychology.com and also at Arkham Asylum Doc on the socials. I also want to let Michael know that we do have your swag outside the panel. We can hand that over to you.
If anybody else wants swag, maybe we've got stuff.
Michael, if you're not here, it's going to go to somebody else.
Thank you all so much, and please enjoy the rest of your stay.
And
here
thank you, Brian Ward, for moderating.
Thank you, Brian.